Hello, everyone. Today we will be presenting on the South Korean gender system and how gender is structured through institutions such as family, legal identity, and the military. Here's a quick look at our table of contents for the presentation today. This is our team, and we will be walking you through our presentation today.
Hello everyone, my name is Carl. Today I'll be summarizing and analyzing the article The South Korean Gender System LGBTI in the context of family, legal identity in the military. The main argument of this paper is that the South Korean legal system doesn't just happen to be biased, it is also actively built upon a strict male and female binary. The authors argue that the state uses three main pillars: family, legal identity, and the military, and it uses to define who gets the proper national subject, also known the concept of Komin. Let's tackle the first pillar being family. In South Korea, the family institution isn't just a private matter, it's a tool for state administration. Through the systems like the Family Relations Register, the state recognizes that the national subjects with strict gender roles. Because same sex marriage isn't recognized, LGBTI people are entirely excluded from forming legal families. Furthermore, they are stigmatized, and because they can't fulfill what the states view as a national duty called reproduction. For transgender individuals, they are also excluded and having massive hurdles to legally change their name. They are often required to prove that they're not married or have children. And this shows the state cares more about maintaining traditional family roles and recognizing an individual's identity. The second pillar would be legal identity. This is strictly enforced through the resident registration system. In every citizen, there's an ID number. One being no, it starts with one being a male. If it starts with two, you're a female. And imagine the daily stress of someone who is transgender or gender nonconforming. A simple trip to the bank or somewhere who needs a legal document, you'll have to go through a bunch of legal processes if you don't look like what you are describing yourself versus your ID card, which in the legal process to change the number of highly medicalized and treating transgenders like a mental disorder, this people's trans and gender nonconforming are now treated with having a disorder and needs to be fixed. The third pillar, the military. The military, the South Korean military is a massive enforcer of militarized masculinity. It's the only institution in the country that explicitly criminalizes homosexuality under Article 92-6. And this law actually punishes consensual same sex acts. And during the individual's physicals, their bodies are not only evaluated before combat, they're also evaluated on how they're able to conform to their gender norms. Transgender individuals face humiliating psychological acts, ultimately being marked as disordered and excluded to high value military services. So, how do we analyze all of this? The greatest strength of the article is that it moves the conversation away from the individual's prejudice and points towards to the state sponsored discrimination. The author successfully proved that homophobia and transphobia in South Korea are institutionalized. They are features of the systems and they're not bugs. The state strictly ties the idea of citizenship, being a good Komin, to the patriarchal structures in compulsory production and hyper masculine military service. And if you cannot or will not participate in those specific ways, you are deemed unsuitable. The most critical takeaway from the author's analysis is that the challenge of the LGBTI movement itself. If the foundational systems in South Korea like the military and the traditional family, requires the marginalization of queer bodies to function, then simply asking for inclusion is not enough. If the movement itself fights for assimilation, like just asking for same sex marriage, it leaves the oppressive binary systems intact. And those who can't conform to the pre-existing binary will not be will be marginalized by the South Korean citizenship model, and true equality itself does not exist.
For this section, I will explain the main argument of the reading, along with how the authors support it through evidence and methodology. Starting with methodology, the authors take a structural and institutional approach. Instead of focusing on individual experiences alone, they analyze key state systems in South Korea, including the family registration system, legal identity system, and military policies. By examining these institutions, they show that gender is not just something personal or biological, but something that is actively produced and regulated by the state. This allows them to shift the focus from individual identity to the broader structures that shape how gender operates in society. Moving on to evidence, the authors use three main institutional examples to support their argument. First, the family systems, or the family headship system. This system historically organized families through male lineage, reinforcing patriarchal authority. Even after its abolition, family registration systems continue to define identity through heteronormative family roles, meaning that gender expectations are still embedded within how families are structured and recognized. Second, the legal identity system, especially the resident registration number. This system permanently assigns gender to individuals and is required for everyday activities such as employment, banking, and legal recognition. This shows that gender is not just socially recognized, but also bureaucratically fixed and regulated. Additionally, changing one's legal gender requires strict institutional approval, which further demonstrates how the state controls gender identity. Third, the military system, which is a key institution in South Korea. Mandatory military service is closely tied to masculinity and citizenship. Completing military service is seen as a requirement for being recognized as a legitimate male citizen. At the same time, the military regulates male bodies, behavior, and even sexuality, reinforcing a very specific and disciplined form of masculinity. When we bring all of this together, it leads to the main argument of the reading. The authors argue that the South Korean gender system is produced and regulated through state institutions rather than being a simple matter of personal identity or cultural belief. These institutions define who counts as a legitimate Kangmin or national citizen through expectations such as participation in heteronormative family roles and military service. So, ultimately, gender is not something individuals express, however, it is a structural system enforced by the state. This means that gender inequality is not only about individual attitudes or discrimination. Instead, it is deeply embedded in institutional frameworks that shape identity, citizenship, and social belonging.
Alright, so I will be starting off by discussing key terms, sentences, and paragraphs in this article. So let's start off with hojuje and hozu. So these two words mean the family headship system and the family head, respectively. And the system actually automatically puts labels and roles on genders, which then further influences the meaning of the word kangmin, which is actually the given significance based on gender. For example, an adult man is a father, an adult female is a mother, seniority, and status. So the word kangmin is actually heavily influenced um, by the importance that the Hojuje system gives to a family member, which is also heavily based on the gender of the family member. And for the sentence on page 364 that I have over here, this emphasizes how the military was always and is still built on male participation. And the military actually provides different treatment and duty assignments to trans bodies, especially female to male, despite them being male, or despite them identifying as male, because of biological origin. And for the last sentence here, that page 361, I wanted to discuss how reproduction is not only just one's fulfillment, but is also a way to measure how dedicated one is to their nation. And this is especially important for a man because they are seen as heirs to their family heirs to continue their family bloodline. So if a son were to transition to a daughter under Hojuje rules, the family bloodline would not be able to continue. All right, and this paragraph here that spans pages 360 and 361 discusses how the South Korean government actually employs a lot of obstacles for gender changing applicants in order to protect societal structures, traditional societal structures. So actually, traditional families, especially parental figures, actually heavily are grew up on these Hojije system rules, and they actually serve as extensions of the Hojije and heteronormative ideologies. And the government will actually take advantage of this by forcing parental consent, despite the age, no matter the age of the applicant. And non-binary transitioners actually further challenge the Hojije system because they don't fall into a man or a woman under the system. And this is also why the Republic of Korea only offers male or female choice. And South Korea actually treats gender change as a role change because gender heavily influences one's significance under a family.
And now for the connections to other course readings. So I want to first talk about an article in week 3 titled Wild Geese Fathers by Kang, written in 2012. So this article discusses how South Korean fathers are actually indirectly challenging and leaving patriarchal and traditional ideologies in the name of providing for their children. So I want to first highlight the similarities between Nahan and Ku's article and Kang's article by saying that they both address how certain genders should actually not have roles automatically assigned to them. And they also talk about how gender roles are changing now in modern times. And now for the differences. So Kang addresses gender role shifts through the wild geese fathers, which take on more roles, taking on both masculine and feminine parental roles in the name of providing for the children overseas. While Na Han and Kun discuss more gender role shifts on an individual and intra-family familial level with a more focus on role changes versus role additions, unlike Hang's Wild Geese Fathers. And they also talk about how gender change essentially equates to role change under traditional Hojije rules, and this causes different Kangmin distributions within families, which challenges the Hojije system. And then now I also want to talk about another article in week 2 called The Abolition of the Family Head System, written by Kim S. and Kim K. at 2024. So this article discusses how feminists are fighting against the family head system, pointing out its skewed benefits towards one gender, male. So for the similarities of this article, both articles discuss the power and privilege imbalances between the two genders, male and female, in South Korea. So while Kim S. and Kim K's article mainly emphasizes how feminists expose favoritism towards men and female oppression in the Hojiji system, Nahan and Ku further expand on the idea of female oppression by discussing how South Korea treats gender change as a role change, which is actually heavily based on traditional expectations of a South Korean woman, and how South Korea treats male to female transitioners in the military, in general, as people who are giving up their masculine privilege and duties, such as breadwinning and bloodline continuation, as I mentioned earlier, for example, becoming someone who the system traditionally deems as lower leveled or weaker. And finally, the military actually assigns different duties and psychological analyses for female to male transitioners, which Na Han and Ku discuss.
For this slide, I want to focus on how course readings show that gender systems in South Korea are both highly structured and also unstable at the same time. Starting with Na, gender inequality in South Korea is embedded in state institutions like the family registry, legal ID systems, and especially the military. These institutions don't just reflect gender norms, they actively enforce them. The military is key in defining the ideal man, where masculinity is tied to completing service, following heteronormative family rules, and fitting official gender categories. This connects to Kungmin, the ideal national citizen, showing that masculinity is judged based on how well individuals meet state defined expectations. Yi and Gibson build on this by showing how the system actually works in real life. Focusing on transgender soldiers in the South Korean military, they show that the military doesn't just assume someone's gender, it actively checks and controls it. Transgender soldiers go through medical exams and strict evaluations to determine whether they fit into the male category. This makes it clear that gender is not treated as something natural or fixed, but something that needs to be constantly verified. In other words, the system depends on ongoing monitoring and control to maintain its definition of masculinity, rather than being something stable on its own. What's especially important here is that this exposes instability within the system itself. If masculinity were truly fixed, there would be no need for constant verification. The fact that military must repeatedly defend the gender binary shows that its authority relies on ongoing control. In this way, transgender soldiers don't just exist within the system, they reveal its weaknesses by forcing it to justify its definitions. In contrast, Yang shifts focus away from state institutions to online communities, offering a more cultural perspective. He shows that these spaces allow marginalized men to question and reshape dominant ideas of masculinity. Through loser aesthetics, individuals reject expectations of success, discipline, and dominance, embracing identities outside of these norms. This isn't always direct resistance, but it still challenges dominant standards. By existing outside these expectations, individuals show that masculinity is not as fixed as it appears, with online spaces becoming sites where it can be redefined more flexibly. Overall, this highlights a contrast between state masculinity and cultural backlash. While Na shows how masculinity is enforced from top down, and Yin Gitsin reveal its instability, Yang shows how it can be challenged from the bottom up through everyday practices. Together, these readings show that masculinity in South Korea is constantly being produced, challenged, and negotiated across different spaces. These external sources by Ha and Huang help broaden the discussion by showing that masculinity in South Korea is shaped not only by state institutions like the military, but also by culture and larger global forces. Together, they make it clear that masculinity is not one fixed idea, but something that shifts depending on the space and context. Some environments reinforce traditional rigid forms of masculinity, while others open up room for alternative ways of expressing identity. Starting with Ha, the focus on pop culture, specifically adult male K-pop fans, often referred to as the uncle fan generation. Ha shows that these men express forms of masculinity that don't align with the traditional ideal tied to discipline, strength, and military service. Instead, they often display traits like emotional openness, care, and admiration for idols, which are usually not associated with dominant ideas of masculinity. This challenges the assumption that being masculine must involve authority, control, or national duty. By openly engaging in fan culture, these men help normalize different ways of being masculine, which makes it harder to maintain the idea that there's only one correct model. This shows how cultural spaces can quietly reshape gender norms. Like Yang suggests, resistance doesn't have to be direct. Simply existing outside dominant expectations can challenge them. Here, K pop fandom creates a space for more flexible forms of masculinity, less tied to institutional rules. Over time, these everyday practices can gradually shift broader understandings of gender. In contrast, Huang takes a structural and historical approach, examining US military camp towns during the Cold War. He shows that masculinity was shaped by American military power, with men's identities tied to labor, hierarchy, and survival within that system. Masculinity here emphasized discipline, control, and rigid gender roles. Comparing the two, Huang shows that masculinity as imposed through systems of power, while Ha highlights how it can be reshaped through culture and daily practices. Together, they show that masculinity in South Korea is not fixed, but constantly negotiated across institutional and everyday contexts.
All right, so here are the three discussion questions that we have prepared for you all. So please take your time to read them and answer them carefully. Thank you.